Now we've come to the back of Willy Lott's house, and incidentally it's Willy Lott's house, not cottage. Quite a substantial building, in fact. Now we've come to the back of it, and I think it makes a more interesting and less familiar view than the one that Constable painted in his famous picture, a 6-footer called the Wain. Now this is a view that a few people get to see because it's the private area of the Field Studies Council Flatford Mill Centre, but I think it makes an interesting composition. Now the first thing I need to do is decide how I'm going to frame this, and as I stand here my immediate reaction is that I look up across the grass up into the path towards Willy Lott's, and therefore I've decided to do a portrait format, an upright painting rather than a traditional landscape. Now this is a view I've painted before as a demonstration for students on courses here. So although I had planned to do a painting on site, I'm actually just going to do another drawing of the view and then translate it into a painting in the studio where I can concentrate on what I call picture making rather than literally copying what's in front of me. Now the purpose of this little sketch is just to get the bare bones of the construction. I don't have to worry too much about positioning it on the piece of paper. I can do that when I translate it, or transfer it I should say, to a piece of watercolour painting, paper. So I'm going to do the upright of this black shed on the right first of all. Edward's room, as it's called. And the main problem when it comes to painting is how do you depict a dark building without going too black. Now the other painting problem is all of this grass in the front, which I think is quite important, and it's got at the moment some wonderful dappled shadows which are worth recording. And then we'll do this, just to do this tree. There's a little figure up there on this path. Make sure you get all of the foreshortening of the distance and the window. This is a 3B pencil. It's important to get a little bit of shading in to indicate the tones. And although the ridges of the buildings are a little bit curved after years of subsidence, I think you should try and maintain the perspective, otherwise it won't look right. Never underestimate how large some of these trees are. not only are they a lot higher than we think, but they are also a lot wider than we think. Got these leaves and this twigs hanging down here, and lots of nettles and shrubs on the bottom left here. Everything's a little bit muddled there. Now, in many ways, the shadows were a bit better earlier on, when the sun was further over to the right of my shoulder, and consequently this was all in the shade, and it cast a nice shadow across here. So I might go with the earlier view of the sun, or where the sun was. Now I can see that as regards painting, one of the problems will be, how dark do I make this shed and still retain another tone to go even darker for the shadows. So if I set that's really dark, and then this is not going to be quite so dark, I introduce some interesting colours. Any little unevenness in the grass is also worth exaggerating, just in order to make what could be quite a plain, uninteresting area more interesting. Right, well, I think I've got enough information in terms of tone and edges and colours and colour notes, particularly in my head, to do a painting from. As I say, I'm familiar with this scene. I've painted it a couple of times before on site, so that'll help me free myself away from being literally true and making a painting which still reflects the feeling of being here and the natural view that you look at when you're standing here wanting to go up the path. So we'll see how we get on in the studio. Right, now we're back in the studio from our visit to Flatford, and we're going to see what I can paint using my memory and my sketch. To say memory is a bit misleading, because it is a subject I've painted on plein air in front of students who have been on a course there. So my memory is hardened by actually painting there. However, painting this subject in the studio, and slightly different, there's no point in just repeating what you've already done, just to experiment a bit, to see what we can make of this subject. Now here's the pencil sketch I brought home from Flatford Mill, which was in Constable country in Suffolk. I'll be interested to see what I can do with all of this foreground, keeping it simple. I think I mentioned before that when I was standing there, your eye automatically went up the pathway that you would walk at the back of Willy Lott's. And I think it's important to consider how you are going to frame, enclose the scene that you want to paint, and enclose it in a way that reflects where you would naturally look when you were standing there. You might be interested to see the painting, the original painting from the I did it on plein air as a demonstration for students on a course in Suffolk, and I'll be interested to see how it varies, the studio piece from the plein air piece. The day was slightly different, but I can take some of the experience I had when I was doing this and some of the experience I had when I was doing the drawing yesterday to make a different painting, albeit one that reflects the character of the place without being too literal, and to give a sense of being there. Now, I've sketched this out on a piece of Saunders Waterford £200 rough paper. It's the traditional paper, not the extra high white. Now I think what I'll do is, the sky is not a significant area in this painting, so I'll start with that. It was a sunny day, I remember. So I'm trying to sort of visualize what it was like when I was there. So this is cobalt blue. Dig into the paint, have nice rich soft paint, and add water to the mixture rather than keep adding paint to water. We'll start at the top. There's a few light clouds in various places, so this is just a little bit of light red and raw sienna with lots of water, just to sort of warm up the paper. We'll join that to the blue, back to a little bit of blue. I must be careful that the clouds don't echo the shape of the buildings. I want them to look as if they go behind the buildings. So many people in painting round the buildings make the clouds the same shape as the buildings, and it's not always obvious until later on, when it's too late to do anything about it. Over the foliage there was a few leaves growing up there, and round the buildings. Now I think in this particular case what I'll do is I'll work downwards. We have the cream colour of the Willy Lott's house. Always a difficult colour to get, actually. It's just sort of warmed up. The sun was on this side earlier in the morning, and I'm going to follow my sort of guide of try and paint each area once. So I come down there, and then we can carry on with the path. It's all very light. We get the light washes in first. So I'm painting this in a fairly traditional way. This is a little bit of cadmium orange. Scoot along the path there. There's a sliver of path there. Keep that nice and light. And then we get to this huge area of grass. A bit intimidating, but I'd be interested to see whether I can get away with painting such a large area of grass. Sun was full on it. This is a bit of starting off with Viridian as my base green, I added a little bit of cadmium yellow and some raw sienna. A bit more raw sienna now. Just push any minor variations in the colour of the grass. I'm going to go straight over that, all those weeds and shrubs on the left hand side. There was a little dip, a little bit of mud, so burnt sienna, just there. Then carry on. There'll be some shadows laid on this, so I need to sort of think in terms of making sure this is dark enough to represent something that looks quite solid, namely the grass, but also keep it light enough, a bit more raw sienna, a bit more viridian, light enough to take a shadow on top. I'll warm it up now. Let's put a bit of cadmium orange with it, just to liven it up a bit. Cadmium orange is quite an opaque colour, so it makes it quite solid. A bit more viridian. Every time I go back to the palette, I add a little bit of dip into something else. A bit more cadmium orange perhaps. And if you work deliberately and paint it as carefully as you can, starting at the top and working down, making sure that you've really covered all of the paint. Don't get to the position at the bottom of the painting and then have to go back up here when you with a damp brush. If you have to go back, make sure you go back, and this is viridian and raw sienna, make sure you go back with thicker paint, just a tiny, not a brush loaded with water. That's asking for trouble. And if that's dry there, we can just indicate this grass here. And there's a sliver of sunny grass there as well. Good, so surprising really, in a few minutes, how much of the paper I've already got covered with paint. Now this grass and the sky are all dry now, so we can carry on working. I'm using my usual range of colours, 4 of each of the 3 primaries, 4 blues, 4 reds and 4 yellows, Windsor blue, green, French ultramarine, cobalt blue, cerulean blue, burnt umber, burnt sienna, light red, cadmium red are the 4 reds, raw umber, raw sienna, cadmium yellow and cadmium lemon are my 4 yellows. And then I've got other odds and ends here. That's a bit of ivory black, alizarin crimson, viridian green, cobalt violet and cadmium orange. Now they've got this large dark, what most people would describe as a black shed on the right hand side here. So again, I need to consider that it is dark, but also it's not as dark. I mustn't make it so dark that I don't leave any another tone I can go to get the dark shade on this side where the shadow is. Remember, black in the sun can be lighter than the shadowed side of a white building. So the one thing I don't want to do is paint it a uniform black shape. This is a little bit of burnt umber and ultramarine and alizarin crimson. So I'm going to keep changing the colour, and as long as we can keep it to the same tone, equally dark, let's just see what that looks like. Yep, so we come up here. Do the drawing bit first, the hard bit first, It's a building. I need to make this quite solid looking. Let's put a bit of burnt sienna with that now, just to warm it up. Keep it roughly the same tone. Now let's put a little bit more ultramarine blue with it. Come down here. This be nice to have a little bit of alizarin crimson now. And now let's have a bit more burnt umber and a little bit of cobalt for a change. Just want to make it a little bit more interesting for the viewer, but not so interesting that they, in a sense, notice it. They will notice it if it's boring, but they won't notice it if it's visually interesting, hopefully. Keep changing it, and then we get down to the bottom. And there's a little bit of light there, so let's take some some raw sienna and come along the bottom there. I'll just take up some of that moisture, because along that bottom edge, I'll just transfer to a slightly smaller brush. Along that bottom edge there were some inevitable weeds, so a bit of viridian and raw sienna. Stiffer paint, utilising the moisture on the paper to further dilute what I'm about to put in here. Let's just indicate the odd bits of weeds that are growing up there. And then while that's drying, we can go ahead and put the shaded side of the Willy Lott's house. This particular view of Willy Lott's house is not readily accessible to the general public. It's behind it. Always a tricky thing to do this. Get a bit of raw sienna and cobalt violet, which I find is a useful colour for neutralising things. Just put a tiny, that's a bit too much, tiny bit of cadmium orange with it. This is the shaded side of this. A bit more raw sienna with that. A little bit of shadow underneath here. I'll come back and do that shortly. Bit more cobalt violet. Again, practicing changing the, let's put a tiny bit of cerulean blue. Probably a bit too much. But notice I'm just working my way down this. Come down to here. And then we can put a bit of cerulean blue in the shadow underneath the gutter line there. And there's a sort of dappled shadow across here from these trees, which we can put in. And obviously the nature of that shadow is going to be different to the shaded side of a sort of man-made form. So I need to break it up a bit, have some light, so it gives a clue to the viewer as to what is forming that shadow. Now that's dry, we can set about the roof of Willy Lott's. I think it's always nice to try and find a view of an iconic subject like Willy Lott's house, which John Constable painted in the Wain. I think it's nice to find a different view but also have a go at the same view as well, because you then become very much aware of there's just a bit of light red, very much aware of the changes, in this case Constable made, for the benefit of his painting. We tend to just accept a little bit of burnt sienna and burnt umber. We tend to accept that artists paint the literal truth, and are often surprised, assuming we've noticed, that they've changed quite a lot of things, simply because they felt it improved the painting, the composition. A little bit of dark just underneath here, not a hard line, and we can also just put in the dark down here, a little bit of dry brush, and here, and perhaps just suggest this window with a bit of dry brush. And then back to the roof. Let's put a bit of cadmium red with that. Bit more light red. On the chimney stack. Come across the bottom here. Now this tree comes all the way across there. I'll just, with a bit of stiff paint, again ultramarine and a bit of burnt sienna, just to get a little bit of it. There's not actually a gutter, but it is quite dark just along there. Now this tree, actually, when you squint at the subject, it was very difficult to see the tree against the roof. So if there's not a hard edge there, in the same way as there's a hard edge of the roof against the sky. And curiously enough, in watercolour, it's quite difficult to not paint what you can't see, if I can put it like that. Particularly with regard to edges. So this tree sort of hangs down over here, which of course is forming casting these dappled shadows. And then usually if I was painting something, I would start at the top. On this occasion I've started at the bottom, but anyway, let's go back. Start at the top now. Bit of raw sienna and viridian. Viridian's a horrible green, of course, to use, but it is permanent and it is cold, and it's cold. But it was the green that John Singer Sargent used a lot for his greens, and with a variety of yellows, it's useful as a base green. And then this comes up against the roof. Put a bit of burnt sienna with it now, because there's some sort of darks in here. One or two little holes in this tree, but it wasn't. It's a pretty solid tree and a bit uniform in terms of sort of being round. Well, nature can do what it likes, but if I make it too tidy, it won't look like nature. And then burnt sienna with some viridian. Not too much water, just to give some darker shapes in the foliage. You've got to recognise this tree is a backdrop really to set up other areas. We could just indicate one or two little leaves just with the fingernail that are catching the light. Again, I don't want to overdo that. And while that's drying, and bear in mind the edges, this is really dark in here, so it's nice stiff paint. Put a bit of burnt sienna with that now. Going to change the colour. Want that edge to be nice and straight. Then the furthermost buildings were a light colour, and this one of them was just catching a little bit of sun in the morning, just on that end there. Some green weeds and things growing up the bottom, or along the bottom edge here. But don't stop. Ultramarine and light red. Let's make sure you connect the car shadow to the shaded side. So it came across here, and we'll just put a little bit of raw sienna with that, and then came across the grass here. Very important sort of shadow. And important to get those in one if you can. And then we can start to do a little bit of work on the detail here. I think detail is very poorly understood. Oh, it's a little bit of bit dark along here as well. I think far too many people simplify their paintings by eliminating detail. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, when you apply the word simple to painting, it's not about what you've painted, it's about how you've painted. Painting detail simply is the important thing. And after all, many of us are attracted to detail. It's unnecessary detail, and detail perhaps that we haven't noticed, but a lot of people, we would be aware of this. So the painterly problem really is to paint it and leave marks which attract more or less the same amount of attention as they did in reality. If you overdo the detail to the extent that it's more noticeable in the painting than it was in reality, then you've overdone it. A little bit of a car shadow underneath that. We can have a little bit of a breather now and clear up the palette before we go on and do some more work on this wall here. Right, well, let's just finish off this building here. Bit of raw umber, ultramarine. see what we can do with this, just to indicate. Put a bit of burnt sienna with it. Now, very often these small areas are quite warm. I like to sort of pick it up, lose it, and make it slightly. I don't want it to all be. I don't want it to look like an exercise book with ruled lines. So don't take them to the corner, because there's a little edge down there on the corner. Try and do each one slightly differently. Do that one differently. Work your way steadily across here. Treat each plank with a bit of respect. And some real dark paint, ultramarine and burnt umber, bit of dry brush, and we can indicate these windows. Again, it's important, try and paint those windows, just give a sense of what they are without overdoing it. And there's another one here. Bit of burnt umber, burnt sienna with that, and we can get the dark side, the shaded side. Using my sort of guide, touch the paper once, so I don't paint the whole of the chimney stack with the red of the sunny side. I paint each area just the once. So to get that clean, fresh look, I'm always thinking, try and get it the once. So sort of few windows, sort of bits and pieces down here. Now perhaps we ought to just start at the top and work downwards, do some of these little leaves here, all hanging down, indicating change of the season. Some yellow ones and green ones. Another yellow one here. And then just with a very small rigger, see if we can just indicate the branches. we'll work forward. There's a couple of little figures here which I think help give you the scale. They're the heads. In deference to Constable, let's give this chap a red coat. The other one can be slightly darker, sort of blue, and then just indication of their legs. A bit of burnt sienna. Don't want to overdo it. And then there was the gate. I'm doing this just with a small rigger. Again, I don't want to sort of overdo the detail here. So do it with sort of little brisk strokes. To avoid going backwards and forwards over and over, which simply draws attention to an area where the viewer probably wouldn't be looking. Then we've got all of these huge shrubs and things on the left-hand side. I shall do some overpainting on here, but this is just a preliminary wash to build up some texture. A little bit of scratching of the fingernail, and a bit of alizarin crimson. Essentially, they close off this left-hand side to the viewer, and that's really what I'm doing. It's a bit of ultramarine. And cadmium yellow. Lighter green, and then quite dark just down in here. And then soften that bottom bit so it joins on to the grass, and with some winds of blue and burnt sienna, that will make a real rich, particularly if I put a bit of raw sienna, real rich dark. And because there was some bit of warmth in some of the leaves. Now just let that, just let that cook for a few minutes, and we'll do some of these shadows down here. just to compare the lighting. This is this. Remember, this is a sketch I'm working from, so I'm trying to maintain this sort of light and shade and the dappled light across here now. So I'm pushing the colours just that little bit more, and the tones, perhaps lightening the light areas and darkening the dark areas. Now this is a bit of ultramarine, and let's have some light red. Now when the sun comes round, there's a sort of a bush just over out of the range on the that casts a dappled shadow on the side of the what is in fact Edward's room, named after the Edward Jackson, the long-serving warden of the Flatford Mill Field Studies Centre. And there's the shadow there. And then add a little bit of raw umber, ultramarine, raw sienna, I think. Keep it nice and blue. And quite wet and transparency. It's very important that shadows are transparent. You look through them. And we've got there was a dappled shadow come across here. Bit more ultramarine, bit of raw sienna now. Turned it a bit more green. In many ways, what this shadow does is it reduces the working part of the picture, in a sense, the part that's in the light. Because people will look, hopefully, over the shadow into the distance. Now we just make one or two little sort of marks in the grass. I'll just cover that so it's not too much in the way of sparkle there. And as a little example of the importance of light and shade in determining a subject to paint. It's not what you've painted, it's how you've painted, and it's the light and shade. So the eye goes hopefully straight over all of these shaded areas at the foot of the picture, and you look into the light. Now those two figures are dry, I can add the grown up with them. Here. There's a lot of, and then ultramarine. little bit of raw cadmium yellow there, so that they give them a sense of distance. So I hope that's not too prominent. Tiny bit of red on the scarf there. And one or two little sort of just marks, just to make it a little bit more untidy. I think you must remember losing all detail, in a sense, polishes up the landscape and gives a false sense of how tidy everywhere is. Nature and man are untidy, and therefore it's important to reflect that. And if it's too devoid of detail, it doesn't read right. Now there's some distant trees round the back here. Ultramarine, perhaps a little bit of raw sienna. A bit more. Help. Set up that chimney. Get a different type of edge as well, sort of dry brush edge. A duller green, of course, than this one, in order to give it a sense of distance. And there's various shrubs here. Bit of raw umber. Bit of texture to the path. Restate that. And I've just put in a tiny little bit of dark. In various parts of this tree. Bear in mind, with the light coming from the right-hand side of the tree, sorry, the left-hand side will be in shade. And it goes inside the tree. Right. Give him a little bit of a belt. Nice little marks here, a few more leaves. Now I think we've just about there actually now. I think that's sort of nicely caught the general feel of standing there in that little pathway, looking up towards the back of Willy Lott's house, past the side of Edward's room and the old wash houses at Flatford Mill. Well, I hope you've enjoyed watching me paint this picture. Incidentally, I've just realised I've only used 3 brushes to paint this. These two, what some people would regard as a medium size, and 2 medium-sized brushes and the rigger. I try and emphasise the idea of using good, strong, rich colour delivered to the paper as simply as you can the once, and avoid overpainting anything until you've at least got everywhere painted once, and then you can better judge the successive layers of tone. Selecting a subject's important. Don't worry so much about what it is, worry about the light and shade and whether you can make the light and shade work for you. And also don't worry too much about detail. If you're worried about the detail, just look at Norman Rockwell's paintings. They are full of detail. I think it's important to paint the detail as simply as you can. And by oversimplifying the scene, it can make the world look a little bit sort of polished and unreal, whereas in fact it's messy and untidy. Thanks for watching.